The desert floor cracked under the weight of something it had never been asked to bear before. Dawn was a grey smear on the horizon when the noise arrived, a low, grinding mechanical thunder rolling across the hardpan of the Egyptian frontier. It was not fast. It was not graceful. What emerged from the darkness moved at the pace of a man jogging. But what it lacked in speed, it compensated for in presence. Squat, rounded, almost brutish in its proportions, it ploughed forward as if the ground itself owed it passage. And then the Italian guns opened up. The shells struck and did nothing. They hit the hull and glanced. They hit the turret and skipped. The soldiers crouching behind this grinding iron wall, British infantrymen who had crossed deserts and prayed for exactly this kind of cover, watched the impacts with something approaching disbelief. Then, one by one, they rose from the sand and kept walking, because the tank was still moving, because nothing the enemy threw at it seemed capable of making it stop. The tank was the Matilda II, and in the winter of 1940, it was arguably the most survivable fighting vehicle in the world. And yet almost nobody wanted it. This is the central paradox of the Infantry Tank Mk II, the A-12, better known simply as the Matilda. Built slow, mocked as ponderous, dismissed as a relic of older thinking, it was called obsolete before it had fired a shot in anger. Critics pointed to its modest speed, its mechanical complexity, its gun that could punch through enemy armour but struggled to provide the high-explosive support infantry sometimes desperately needed. When faster tanks paraded across newsreels, the Matilda looked like a museum piece on legs. But in the right place, at the right time, under the right conditions for reasons that were entirely deliberate, it became something extraordinary. A lifeline, a shield that walked, a machine that broke enemy morale and safeguarded Allied lives at moments when nothing else could have done the same job. To understand why, you have to go back to the thinking that built it. The First World War had not been kind to men who crossed open ground toward defended positions. The lesson, written in a generation of casualties, was brutal and simple. Infantry in the open died. The problem was not courage. The problem was physics. The solution the British Army worked toward imperfectly, fitfully, but genuinely was the tank. Not as a cavalry substitute or a fast exploitation vehicle, but as a moving fortress, walking alongside the men it protected, absorbing the fire they could not survive alone. By the mid-1930s, this thinking had crystallized into what was called Infantry Tank doctrine. Build a class of tank whose primary virtue was armor protection, whose role was to accompany foot soldiers, and whose speed needed only to match a man walking through difficult ground. Speed was secondary. Survivability was everything. The Matilda II was born from this requirement. Development began in the mid-1930s, aimed at producing a vehicle genuinely resistant to the standard anti-tank weapons of the day. The resulting tank was not elegant. It was never meant to be. Archive photo, infantry tank prototype or period specifications image. The hull was heavily armoured at its thickest points, reaching protection that, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, made it effectively immune to most anti-tank guns then in widespread service. Designers calculated that a Matilda would simply shrug off those rounds at typical combat ranges. They were correct. For a while they were devastatingly, consequentially correct. But the trade-offs were real. The armour came at several prices. The first was weight. The Matilda was heavy relative to its size, and that weight demanded a propulsion system that strained to move it at anything approaching useful battlefield speed. Its twin diesel engines could push the tank to roughly 8 miles per hour on a good road. Cross-country, that figure dropped. In soft sand or broken terrain, it dropped further. Compared to the cavalry tanks that roamed the same battlefields, the Matilda moved at a crawl. This was a choice, not an accident. A Matilda could not exploit a breakthrough, race around a flank, or pursue a retreating enemy. It was a creature of the set-piece assault, the deliberate advance behind which infantry could move with reasonable confidence. The second price was mechanical complexity. The twin-engine arrangement, combined with the tolerances required to keep such a heavy vehicle moving, meant the Matilda demanded skilled maintenance to stay operational. In the western desert, heat, dust, and vast distances from supply lines conspired against every piece of equipment. Breakdowns were not rare. The vehicles that reached their objectives were often a fraction of those that had set out. The third price was the gun. The Matilda II carried the QF2 Pounder, a 40mm weapon that was, by 1940 standards, a creditable anti-armor piece. It could penetrate the armor of Italian tanks with reasonable authority, and against lighter German vehicles of the early war period it was reasonably effective at appropriate ranges. But the Pounder fired armor-piercing rounds. It had no useful high-explosive shell in standard service, and here, for the infantry it was built to support, was a meaningful gap. When a British infantry platoon approached a defensive position, a machine gun nest, a field gun, a fortified structure, they wanted the tank to eliminate it with a high-explosive round. The Pounder could not reliably do that. The armor-piercing shot punched through lighter structures without the blast effect needed to neutralize what was inside. There were times when the Matilda fired into a position and left the defenders shaken but functional. The tank had arrived, had fired, and the problem remained. This was a doctrine problem as much as a gun problem, and it would matter increasingly as the war went on. But before all of that, before the limitations accumulated, there was France, and a May afternoon in 1940 near Arras. The German armoured thrust through the Ardennes had cut through the Allied front with shocking speed. British, French and Belgian forces were being compressed toward the coast. The situation was approaching catastrophe. Into this crisis, British commanders launched a counterattack near Arras with a relatively small armoured force, including Matilda IIs. The German forces encountered expected to handle whatever the British sent. They had anti-tank guns, they had experience, they had momentum, and then the Matildas came through. Standard anti-tank rounds seemed to accomplish nothing. Reports from German units describe alarm the rounds were striking, the tanks were being hit, and still they came forward. The anti-tank guns available to many German infantry formations were not, at typical combat ranges, capable of reliably defeating the Matilda's frontal armour. The machine functioned exactly as designed. It absorbed punishment and kept moving. The psychological effect on gun crews who expected their weapons to work and found them ineffective was significant. The physical effect, as the Matildas pushed through and British infantry followed, was enough to disrupt the German advance in that sector and produce genuine alarm in higher headquarters. Historical accounts suggest that concerns briefly reached senior levels of German command about whether the attack represented a larger threat. It did not change the outcome of the campaign. The forces were too small, the strategic situation too far gone. But Arras demonstrated something the Matilda's designers had built in deliberately. The tank could walk through fire that would have destroyed anything lighter, in daylight, in front of defenders who had every reason to be prepared. In the right engagement, against the right weapons, its armour was not just adequate, it was decisive. If you're finding this story compelling the engineering choices buried inside history, the way a machine's design shapes everything that happens around it, consider subscribing. There's more to come on the tanks, strategies and decisions that shaped the Second World War. The true flowering of the Matilda's potential came not in France but in North Africa, in the winter of 1940 into 1941, during an operation the British called Compass. The Italian forces were organised around a string of fortified camps across the frontier region and into Cyrenaica. Italian anti-tank capability in this period, while not negligible, was built around weapons the Matilda had been specifically designed to defeat. Many forward Italian positions were unable to reliably penetrate the Matilda's armour at normal combat ranges. Operation Compass, launched in December 1940, initially conceived as a large-scale raid. What it became was one of the most lopsided offensive operations of the entire war. A relatively small British and Commonwealth force, with Matildas as the armoured spearhead, advanced hundreds of miles and captured many times its own strength in prisoners. The pattern repeated. British infantry would approach a defended Italian position. The Matildas would lead, drawing fire, surviving fire that would have shredded lighter vehicles. The position would be overrun. The infantry would consolidate while the tanks moved on. The process was not fast, but within the operational framework of Compass, methodical worked. For soldiers defending a position, the moment they realize their anti-tank measures are insufficient is often the moment their will to hold collapses. Reports from the period describe Italian units abandoning prepared positions when the Matildas kept advancing. The weight of iron walking through their fire carried a message about the fundamental balance of force, and that message was demoralizing. The men who crewed the Matildas carried their own relationship with the machine. Working inside one was not comfortable. The interior was cramped in the way most tanks of the era were cramped, with the crew arranged around weapons and mechanical systems requiring physical dexterity and stoic tolerance for noise, heat, and limited visibility. Communication between tanks was a persistent challenge. Radio equipment was fitted, but reliability and use varied considerably. In the heat of action, coordinating Matildas with the infantry demanded practice drill rather than fluid real-time exchange. Visibility from inside was limited in ways that could be genuinely dangerous. The commander needed to navigate terrain, track infantry, identify targets, and remain aware of threats all through optical systems, providing a partial, jerky picture of the world outside. You were safest when you could see least. The armor's enormous protection came paired with profound sensory isolation. That was the central tension, and the Matilda embodied it completely. Despite all of this, there are accounts that speak to what it meant when the armor worked. British tank crewmen in North Africa described impacts from enemy fire felt as sharp vibrations, as loud rings against the hull followed by nothing, no penetration, no fire. The round had arrived and been turned away, and the tank was still moving, and the crew were still alive. For men who understood what happened inside lighter vehicles when armor-piercing rounds came through, this was not trivial. The armor was not just a mechanical specification, it was a reason to come home. From the other side of the wire, the experience was strikingly different. Italian anti-tank crews firing on Matildas in the early phases of Compass operated under a pressure their training had not prepared them for. Doing everything correctly, aiming well, maintaining discipline, engaging at the right range and watching the shots fail. Records and accounts describe the frustration of gunners who saw their rounds strike and deflect. When a weapon fails to perform as expected, the psychological effect ripples outward well beyond the gun crew. This was not universal. Italian forces contained skilled and determined units, and the campaign's outcome owed something to British operational planning as well. But the pattern was consistent enough that the Matilda's impact on Italian morale was noted repeatedly in assessments of the campaign. The tank had been designed to have exactly this effect, to absorb fire, to keep moving, and to drain the will from defenders whose weapons could not stop it. In the winter of 1940 into 1941, it delivered on that promise more completely than perhaps anyone had expected. But wars do not stand still. The armor that made the tank near invulnerable in 1940 was only as effective as the weapons it faced. As the conflict expanded and German forces entered North Africa in early 1941, the tactical environment began to change in ways the Matilda's designers could not fully have anticipated. German anti-tank capability was qualitatively different from what the Matilda had faced. German doctrine made use of anti-tank guns with greater penetrating power, employed more flexibly and coordinated more aggressively. And then there was the 88mm. The 88mm flak gun, primarily an anti-aircraft weapon, had been recognized by German commanders as a devastating anti-tank tool. When deployed in carefully chosen positions that maximized its range advantage, it could engage the Matilda at distances where the British tank's armor provided no reliable protection. It was not everywhere, and not infinitely available, but its use represented a fundamental challenge to the Matilda's fundamental advantage. This was not a sudden, single moment. It was a shift, a gradual tactical adaptation by forces that understood the Matilda's one decisive strength and worked to neutralize it with a weapon that sat outside the categories the tank had been built to defeat. Reports from British tank crews who encountered the 88mm describe the shock of a weapon that could reach them at ranges where they had previously felt secure. The understanding, sudden and difficult, that the armor was no longer enough. The tank itself had not changed. What had changed was the context, the battlefield calculus around it, and there lay a lesson that applied well beyond the Matilda. There was a tank commander serving with a Matilda unit in the Western Desert whose experience survives in the general accounts from this period diffuse enough that precision about individual names is unwise, but consistent enough to represent what many crews went through. His tank had been struck multiple times during an advance. Each time, the crew heard and felt the impact of violent concussion, a ringing, A momentary disorientation followed by the realization that they were still functional, still moving. After the action, they climbed out and counted the marks on the hull, paint stripped in places, metal carrying new geometry it had not had that morning. The crew were uninjured. The tank had reached its objective. What remained in the account was not the technical triumph, but the human meaning of it. He and his crew had crossed ground that would have been fatal in a lighter vehicle, and they had arrived. Stripped of all tactical context, that was what it came down to. The machine had kept them alive when other machines would not have. Infantry who fought alongside Matildas spoke of the experience in terms consistently distinct from their accounts of working with lighter armour. There was something qualitatively different about following a vehicle that drew fire and survived it. A tank you watched get hit repeatedly, that kept moving, that you then followed through the gap it created, that was not the same experience as following something stoppable by the same weapons aimed at you. Accounts describe the straightforward, unglamorous confidence of walking behind something that worked. Not inspired, not romantic, useful. In a desert where cover was scarce and machine guns could sweep terrain for hundreds of yards, a moving shield was genuinely irreplaceable. The arithmetic of the campaign eventually closed around the Matilda. The tank served on in other theatres where its specific qualities remained relevant. In the Pacific, where jungle terrain neutralized many speed advantages of lighter vehicles and anti-tank capability was more limited, Matilda served with Australian forces and performed with genuine effectiveness. Its value was always contextual. Strip away the German 88mm, place the vehicle in terrain that favoured its strengths, and the old arithmetic reasserted itself. Variants were developed. Mine-clearing versions, bridging adaptations, and specialised engineering vehicles extended its service life into roles that played to the platform's robustness. The tank never received a meaningfully upgunned version in British service. The turret ring limited what could be fitted, and production priorities did not allow for a major upgrade. As better-suited tanks arrived, the Matilda's role contracted, but it remained useful in specialised variants and in theatres where the match was right. Its successors inherited the lessons it had taught. The importance of genuinely sufficient armour was not forgotten. The need for better high-explosive capability in infantry support tanks was not forgotten. The cost of mechanical complexity in desert operations was not forgotten. The Matilda's service was, in this sense, also an education. What makes a weapon useful? The easy answer is that it does what it was designed to do, but that answer conceals a harder truth. What a weapon is designed to do only matters in the context in which it actually fights. The Matilda II was designed with a specific enemy capability in mind, under specific doctrine, in support of a specific kind of operation. When those conditions aligned, when the enemy's weapons were of the type the Matilda had been built to defeat, when the terrain suited deliberate infantry-supported advances, the machine was extraordinary. It was not outdated. It was not useless. It was contextually dominant, and the distinction matters enormously. There is a tendency, looking back from distance, to assess weapons by their final fate by the moment they were outclassed or replaced, and to read that end back into their entire existence. To say that because the Matilda was eventually overcome by better anti-tank weapons, it was therefore always insufficient. This is a mistake. The Matilda II held the line at moments when the line needed holding. It walked alongside infantry across ground they could not have crossed alone, drew fire they could not have survived, and delivered them to objectives they could not have taken without it. It panicked capable enemies in France. It unravelled Italian defensive positions across hundreds of miles of desert. It gave British soldiers, in moments of genuine darkness, the experience of being protected, of following something that worked. That it did not last forever as a first-line weapon does not diminish any of that. It simply means that war moved on, as war always does, and the Matilda could not move with it. The tank that was called slow, ponderous, and outdated before it had been tested demonstrated, in the specific time and place it was needed, that doctrine and design intent can create something the battlefield genuinely requires. Not every weapon has to win the whole war. Sometimes, a weapon only has to win the moment. And in its moment, the Matilda II was, for the men it protected, everything.